I am Pocho Salcedo, and I welcome our audience in Latin America and all those who join us from coast to coast here in the continental United States and Hawaii. Once again, let us dive deeper than the headlines. Welcome to the DNA of the news. We enter deep into the intricate and sometimes tumultuous crossroads of politics, morality, and ethics. In a world where decisions made in political arenas can have profound effects on our lives, understanding these decisions, ethical and moral implications, become crucial. We have invited a true expert on the topic to navigate these restless waters. Professor Mike Blake, a political philosopher, welcome to the DNA of the news.
Thanks for having me.
Michael Blake is a professor of philosophy, public policy, and governance at the University of Washington. Until 2016, he was the director of the UW's program on ethics. He received his bachelor degree in philosophy and economics from the University of Toronto, and a PhD from Stanford University. He is jointly appointed to the Department of Philosophy and to the Daniel J. Evans School of Public Affairs.
Let us start with the basics. Can you explain in your words the relationship between politics, morality, and ethics? How do they interact and influence one another?
I think there's two answers to that, really. One of them is that we often complain that they don't interact with each other enough, that often politics is a somewhat amoral or sometimes even immoral activity. Politicians are only interested in their own benefit and so forth. But the other answer, which I think is maybe better, is that the only purpose for politics is ultimately an ethical one. If you think about the government as having these enormous powers of violence, it can put people into jail, it can send them off to war, it has huge resources with which to do good or bad things, then we have to come up with some reasons for why it's doing what it's doing. And often those are reducible to reasons of ethics, which is taking care of the vulnerable, trying to provide people with what we think they're entitled to, defending human rights. And all of these are ultimately statements about ethics, what we owe to each other as human beings.
Thank you, but many argue that politics by nature is a pragmatic enterprise, while morality and ethics concern about ideals. How do you see the relationship between these concepts, and can they coexist harmoniously?
I think they can coexist. I'm not sure that it's always harmonious, because even though we often say that politics is about pragmatics, about getting things done, there's still the basic question of what it is that a government is supposed to be doing. And even if we never get close to an ideal, it's still important to know what the ideal is so we can figure out what sorts of things we want our governments to try to accomplish. So one analogy that I've heard is that the philosophy that we use is sort of like a compass. It tells us where true north is, or it tells us where the thing that we're supposed to be looking for is. It doesn't tell us anything about how to get there. And that's where all the pragmatics come in. But of course, there can be conflicts between getting things done and understanding what the right thing to do is. But if we didn't have some sense of what the right thing was, it's not even clear why we would care so much about what politicians do and what they say.
Historically, leaders have used moral reasons to justify certain political actions. How can we discern between moral leadership and political posturing or manipulation?
That is an extremely good question. And the answer, I think, is that no one can really come up with a solid, ahead of time test for figuring out when politicians are lying or using ethical reasons for a self-interested or otherwise morally inadequate reason. In the end, I think you have to rely on certain notions ultimately of common sense. And one of these, I think, is figuring out whether people are being consistent in their use of ethical reasons. So sometimes when people say, I will defend human rights to the hilt, but only for people I like, or I will take care of the poor, but only of the race that I happen to think is superior, these people are using ethical reasons, but the way they're using them is more likely just a shield for selfishness or self-interest. But I think what you've hit on is a real problem. We often have to be very careful before we say that because someone is using reasons that look like ethical reasons, that they're behaving in an ethical way.
Is it built in politics that to create coalitions and make agreements in societies full of moral compromise, we should expect deception about what one is planning and why? For example, President Roosevelt said the US will not be involved in World War II during his presidential campaign. Still, he was behind the scenes working hard to do that. As a citizen, how do you digest that?
That again is one of the questions that does pose a certain problem, because you're absolutely right that any politician who said, I will never lie, is probably a bad politician, understood in the normal sense of making coalitions, getting deals done, and accomplishing things. But then there's a real question as to why it is that the deception is happening. So in the case of FDR and his deception, he thought that the Nazis were an existential threat to liberal democracy and human rights. So he thought that after the fact, people, when they saw what the Nazi party was doing, they would say that they were glad that they had been deceived. And there are cases during wartime when we don't want to admit the intelligence we have, we don't want to acknowledge where our troops are going, we have to use deception, but people consent to it in a way. They say, you don't have to be fully honest with me. Whether they say that ahead of time or after the fact is an additional interesting factor here. But the core for me is, do people accept that they themselves sometimes have to be deceived in order to get things done? And when the answer is yes, then the deception doesn't seem to be quite so ethically problematic as it is in other cases. At least that's where I end up.
So politics is not about black and white issues, but pretty grayish matters then?
I think there are some black and white issues, but there are other cases in which both sides to a dispute have something that's not crazy to add to the conversation. And also, you might have to do things that look bad to you in order to get what is good accomplished in the long run. It's certainly always shades of gray in terms of how you actually accomplish your goals. But on the other hand, there are some things that you sort of want to say, if this isn't a bad thing, then what do we even do this ritual of government for? Abraham Lincoln said, if slavery is not an evil thing, then why do we even have these words, an evil thing? If slavery is not bad, then nothing is bad. And there, the only question is how you accomplish the goal. It's not that there are shades of gray in whether the goal is rightly pursued.
Thank you. Professor Blake, in today's age of information overload, how do you think media influences our perception of what is moral and ethical in politics?
I am increasingly worried about media for reasons that are not very unfamiliar to anyone who works in or consumes media, which is the phenomenon that media doesn't challenge you enough, at least most media forms of presentation. They essentially tell you that you're already right. So if you look at Fox News or MSNBC, the people who consume them, they already believe that everything can be explained by what they happen to believe. So they can consume media that tells them that the Republicans are demons or the Democrats are demons, and you never have to really confront the possibility of the other side being right. That's a very different media environment. And of course, social media makes things that much worse. I do think that many people who are in the media are trying very hard to push back against that by creating conversations in which you have the opportunity to genuinely hear the other side and not simply make fun of them. But bear in mind that in my country, Fox News and Tucker Carlson and all of these other figures, they only really exist to tell people that their current prejudices are correct, that what they think is right, and the other side should be made fun of rather than listened to. So I believe that media has an obligation that it's often failing to meet to create the possibility of actually listening to the other side.
Thank you very much. Not too long ago, you wrote an interesting article about the U.S. government's decision to unfreeze $6 billion in exchange for 6 U.S. citizens held hostage by Iran. This country has been hostile to the U.S. and has actively sought to undermine U.S. interests for nearly 50 years. Although the families and other Americans are pleased, many others wonder if that was a justifiable action. Your thoughts from the moral and ethical perspective, please.
That, unfortunately, is an enormously big question, because even that paper you're referencing doesn't have a single conclusion about what ought to be done for all these cases. The simple answer, as far as I can see, is no matter what you do, you're running an enormous moral risk of doing something bad. To not rescue the hostage in these cases is to ultimately let people that you could help suffer enormous pains, even death, in a country that is wrongly imprisoning them. It seems to be an abdication of the obligation of a government. Its first obligation is to take care of the human rights of its citizens. But there's also an enormous risk that comes from choosing to actually rescue the hostages in this way, which is you've just allowed $6 billion to flow to a country that treats its own people quite badly and is working against the interest of the United States in a variety of fronts. And you've also set up a circumstance in which you're more likely to get future hostages taken now that Iran is confident that it's profitable. So the unfortunate thing that I would end up saying is that there isn't a solid answer as to what you should do, except perhaps that you ought to figure out ways, if possible, of preventing yourself from being in this circumstance in the first place. But that's very easy for me to say. I'm a philosopher, not a politician. Knowing how to actually prevent future hostage takings is probably a task for people who know a lot more about politics than I do.
And we take a short break. We'll be right back, all the way from the state of Washington on the west coast of the United States of America. And we continue this dialogue on the intersection of politics, morality, and ethics. In this country, we're in a presidential campaign and have certain tolerance for apparent lies. In our case, in the past, we heard that Mexico will pay for an immense costly wall on the border. However, many people supported the policy and never expected to have Mexico pay for the construction of that wall. So as citizens, we understand that what is said is possibly a lie, and we are okay with that?
Unfortunately, I think the answer now is largely yes. This is a sort of worse version of an old-fashioned problem in democracy, which is how do you elect people that you can predict are going to do the right thing as you see it in a variety of circumstances. And often when they make campaign promises, it's not so much to say what they will do, because of course that has an enormous amount of constraints on it. It's to explain how they see the world. And the people who really liked the idea of Mexico building the wall, what they seemed to want was a United States that was adversarial, that was hostile, that was dominant, that was angry at a variety of other world agents and so forth. And that was enough to get people to vote for Donald Trump, at least a great many. I actually think it's a problem because the more the campaign promises deviate from the realm of the possible, the less we actually understand what people are going to do, what they're committed to doing. And even though I think everyone involved knew that Mexico was a sovereign country, it wasn't taxable. You couldn't force another country to give you money. That the more we have that sort of promise, the more we're entering a realm in which people are going to be attracted to what they want to hear, not what actually could happen. So we're seeing this now even with other candidates like Vivek Ramaswamy saying that he wants to deport citizens when they are the children of undocumented migrants. You can't do that. It's a point blank impossibility under the Constitution. But he says he's going to do it anyway. And that's going to be popular because even though it doesn't say anything about what will happen, it says a lot about who he is. So increasingly, I think that's how campaign promises function, is they provide evidence of what someone is, not what they will do.
Thank you. And I'll ask you this, Professor Blake. There were significant moral costs in either remaining or withdrawing from Afghanistan. What is your ethical assessment of the withdrawal of American troops after 20 years and about $180 billion? How was our exit from that country? And did we have the right to be there in the first place?
Unfortunately, as far as I can see, there's not one question about Afghanistan. There's actually a whole bunch of them. One of them is, were we right to be involved in Afghanistan? Another is, were we right to leave Afghanistan? And a third is, did we do it in the right way when we left Afghanistan? And I think the clearest answer is probably the last one. I don't think we left well, because the extent to which we created a power vacuum, left a lot of material there that can be used by malignant agents in the region, all of this suggests that we did it in a hurried and not terribly effective way. But as far as whether we were right to leave, there is a worry, which is that Afghanistan hasn't actually had a single day's peace since 1971. We thought 20 years ago, very naively, that we could go in and make a country. And that speaks of our arrogance, our lack of attention to history. It speaks of a lot of things, but I think what the Biden administration did was to acknowledge that they weren't going to be able to do the job that we intended to do, and that it was better to stop, even though, yes, that's going to have enormously bad consequences for a great many people, including the women of Afghanistan. This, I think, is a case in which we did the right thing in the sense that it was the least bad thing, even though we could have done it in a better way.
Well, and this is in the minds of many Latin Americans. Our political system in the United States makes it very difficult for a third party to run in the general elections. In Mexico, the PRI party held uninterrupted power in the country for 71 years, winning all the elections. In the US, since 1840, more than 180 years ago, two political parties have won all the elections. Are we twice as good as Mexico or twice as bad?
It's a really good question. I don't actually think that there's a simple answer there, because it's possible for there to be a relatively constrained number of parties and for there still be the good things we like about democracy, namely a variety of voices, a variety of alternatives, a genuine and free discussion and all that. It can just get pushed away into the internal discussions of a party. But that's actually kind of an ideal view of what parties could be, especially when you look at the internal structure of the Democratic or the Republican parties. I think this is an area in which the fine detail matters a great deal. And since I know a little but not much about Mexico's political history, I'm in no position to really say what would be better. But I do think that in general, the more that it's possible for people to have a wide variety of alternatives in their politics, the better off the political discussion becomes. And I think we're seeing that now in the internal discussions within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And my guess, although of course I'm not in any way an expert, is that there's probably a very similar factor happening in the internal discussions of the PRI, that the ways in which parties are set up can make it more difficult for there to be genuine and open disagreement between political agents.
Thank you. And I'm always curious about this. The divide between personal and public morality for politicians has always been contentious. Should the personal moral choices of a politician be separate from their public decisions and performance?
No, that is, again, I will have to offer the classic philosopher's response, which is, it depends on what you mean by morality. Sometimes when we speak of morality, we speak ultimately of things like sexuality or someone's private decision-making surrounding religion and things that, in fact, there are good reasons to think of as being matters of privacy. There's a reason why when you go to get a heart surgery, you don't ask your doctor about their sex life. It's not relevant. If they're good at the job, they're good at the job. But the difference in politics is that sometimes someone's apparently personal morality could affect their ability to do the job. So if, let's say, Donald Trump has been consistently lying about his financial status, or he's been engaging in predatory or violent acts towards women, then that might be taken by some people to be relevant to how he would deal with money or how he would deal with women when he's in office. And that's the difference between that case and the case of the heart surgeon. But I do think that we're too quick to think that because someone is a public figure, that everything they do is relevant to our evaluation of them. When John F. Kennedy was in the White House, he was engaged in a lot of sexual antics, which the press didn't cover. And I think that was probably a good decision because that was his business and his wife's business, but it wasn't ours. So it's a very fine line in figuring out whether someone's private morality is relevant. And in part, it depends on whether or not that private morality gives us some information about what they're likely to do in office.
Thank you. Looking at the headlines, migration and refugee crisis have been on the front lines in the last 10 to 15 years. The mass movements of people fleeing conflicts like Syria, civil war, or simply looking for better economic opportunities crossing the southern border of the United States presents moral challenges about borders, national responsibilities, and human rights. Your thoughts, please.
This is one of those questions where I think we're still in the beginning stages of figuring out how to even think about the ethics. There's a significant number of people in the US who are in favor of open borders, who want there to be no constraints on migration, and an equal number who want there to be an absolute bar on all migration. We're thinking of Donald Trump's wall, or even I think Herman Cain proposed a moat with alligators between the US and Mexico. And then figuring out how you even start to think about this question, you have to start with the question of why we're allowed to tell someone who's a peaceful migrant who wants to come to a new place that they can't. And there, I think there's actually a lot of different things that people have tried to say. Some people have spoken about the importance of national identity or social trust, and they point to countries like, say, Japan, which maintains a great deal of social trust and social unity, in part because it doesn't let anyone from the outside come in. But then you have to face up to the fact that countries like the United States and I believe Mexico, which are multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, very complicated social communities, it's not clear that they're allowed to use that excuse. So unfortunately, I have a lot of things that I could say about smaller issues, but I think one thing that should be said is that increasingly migration has become a sort of test case for all kinds of other issues in politics. So when Donald Trump attacks Mexico and says, I will protect you from them, he's not just talking about Mexico, he's talking about race, he's talking about language, he's talking about the unfamiliar. He's become powerful by saying to people who are frightened of linguistic or demographic change, I'll protect you from novelty. You'll still be in charge. And although I imagine there are cases in which you can say that and not be saying a bad thing, in most cases saying that is kind of a bad thing because it indicates something very close to racism at the heart of our politics. So I am very ambivalent about a lot of actual policies regarding migration, but I do think that the ways in which we speak about migration in most countries that migrants try to come to are often infected with something very much like racism.
Well, Professor Blake, in the last minutes left, I will ask you about the U.S. sanctions against other countries. The ones that come to mind are North Korea, Syria, Russia, and Cuba, which has been on our embargo list for many years, and Venezuela, with economic restrictions imposed so its government could collapse. So what is the moral argument of a powerful nation inflicting pain on the regular citizens, even more than the leaders making the decision?
The last thing that you said there, that these sanctions hit the ordinary people more than the politicians, I think that's the core of the problem here. There's really two ethical questions to me. One of them is it right for a country like the United States to try to change other countries? And the second is, if we are right, is this the way we're allowed to do it? And the first question, I think, is actually an interesting one because usually countries have a certain sort of principled toleration of each other. say the United States and Sweden. Sweden's much more liberal, the US is much more conservative, but they each say to the other, you do you, you can be what you want to be, that's your business. But the United States, with some countries, especially ones that are, in its view, in danger of becoming close to communist, it said no. And then there's a real question as to whether or not there is an ethical right to try to stop other countries from going too far down that road. My own view is that this represents more a sort of new form of imperialism rather than a good moral statement. But then the second issue is, if in fact we're allowed to influence other countries, is this the way that we should do it? And there, take something like North Korea, which I think is probably not actually a very respectable form of government. There, it looks much less like a government and much more like an organized crime ring, where the party has control over every aspect of individual lives. But even there, sanctions don't hit the ruling classes. They have been referred to by one person as a weapon of mass destruction in slow motion, because they cause children to die from malnutrition. It's just that we don't have to see explosions or torn up bodies. It works much more quietly over time. I would argue that even if there are cases in which we're right to pressure other countries to stop their practices, as I think we could with North Korea, it's not clear that this method is either effective or morally legitimate, because it harms the people who are already being harmed, and it's not clear that it always is a mode by which we actually are able to get things done.
Thank you very much. In the last 30 seconds, I will ask you a personal question. What was your aha moment when you decided to specialize as a political philosopher? When did that happen?
So a long time ago, I was working for the Bosnian War Crimes Tribunal while I was still in law school. And I was the annoying person at the back who kept on asking, why does the UN have the right to put people in jail? Doesn't a government have to do something before it has the right to imprison people? And that just started me thinking too much about what states or other agencies have to do to be good at the job of being a political body. And once you start going down that road, eventually you end up as a professor. So that's where I am now.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you in the show. I am confident that your classes are full of argumentation and pretty lively.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.